today. Today is the National Day of Racial Healing. Launched in 2017, the National Day of Racial Healing is a call to action for racial healing for all people. It originated as part of the WK Kellogg Foundation's National Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation efforts. Racism and hatred affect all of us, regardless of our backgrounds or our circumstances. We all live in a world born from historic inequalities that have led to broken systems and divisions, where we don't know one another and our shared history. These significant challenges will not be solved by one individual or one group. To ensure that our communities are free of systemic racism, we must come together to explore how past actions have created the present racial inequities in our society. Racial healing is a tool and a process for creating our common humanity and celebrating this common humanity, acknowledging the truths from our shared history and recognizing our collective potential. Through racial healing, we can forge deep, meaningful relationships, lay the groundwork for transforming broken systems, and bridge the divides to transform communities for our children and for future generations. As we enter this unprecedented era in our country, the responsibility belongs to all of us to remember our own humanity and the humanity of others, to recall the teachings to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and to stand up to the bigotry, hatred, and callousness that demeans and dehumanizes us all. We encourage you to participate in these kinds of powerful, honest, and moving experiences and pursue this racial healing journey together with us, both today and in the future. These storytellers that we have today are not just tellers of tales, but they're activists in their own lives. And they are bringing you stories that will talk about both the need for racial healing and give examples of how that healing can happen. Our first storyteller up is Marguerite Scott. Marguerite is coming to us from across the country, as most of us are sitting in Chicago in frigid weather. Hopefully, Marguerite, it's a little warmer where you are. Marguerite is going to tell us a story that she titles Visiting Van Gogh. And Marguerite, can you tell us why you wrote this story?
Well, I know I probably wouldn't have written it if I wasn't in your generations group, because it was a very hard piece to write. But I'm really always fascinated in a horrified way, about power dynamics and how abuse both passes through generations, but also cross-culturally. And so chose to examine kind of an aha that I had from being in your class and looking back at an experience that I had as a child that actually, I don't mention this in the piece, but it had such an impact on me, and it made me unconsciously really become aware of the imbalance in racial dynamics, in a very visceral way.
And so this is Visiting Van Gogh.
Philadelphia Museum of Art, dirt parking lot, fall 1972. A woman steps out of the driver's side of a yellow Volkswagen Bug, goes to the trunk, opens it, pulls out a black iron crowbar, slams the trunk shut, opens the passenger side door, and pulls out a large Doberman pinscher and hits the Doberman 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times unleashing a torrent of rage on the now submissive dog. Mom and I see all this occur, and my mother doesn't even think about what to do, whether or not to intervene. She just does it. She moves swift and even a bit fierce. She moves confident, like a cheetah or a mountain lion, towards the little faded lemon yellow car, towards the thin chocolate brown woman with the iron crowbar, bashing down relentlessly on the black brown Doberman, now oozing liquid red. And my mother does what? I don't really remember. My memory goes dark. All I do know is my mother intervened instinctually. She took action. She stopped the woman. She grabbed the crowbar out of this fury-crazed woman's hands and then what? I'm trying to remember this right. I see that the woman got back into her rusty sunshine beetle. The Doberman now returned to the back seat. My mother still clutching the confiscated crowbar as she struts back to our Green Hornet station wagon. And I'm numb in the front passenger seat. And all I can feel anything for is the wounded Doberman now being driven away to who knows where and who knows what. And my mother tosses the crowbar in the back of the Green Hornet's trunk, but not before carefully wiping off streaks of blood and Doberman flesh and tossing the silk designer scarf, now contaminated by this unfortunate memory, onto the dirty, sand-colored, unpaved ground of the parking lot behind the Philadelphia Museum of Art. My mother calls to me, but I don't move. She raises her voice to that familiar shriek on the edge of madness. Meg, get out of the car. Let's go. Don't make me have to tell you again. So I do. I comply. I obey. I open the front seat passenger door and my legs wobble, searching for stability on solid ground, while my mother fusses through her handbag, reclaims her compact mirror, powders her nose, and reapplies red lipstick to her pursed mouth. She inspects her teeth for smears that aren't there, and I see a moist blood droplet huddled on top of the dry dirt. The earth too dry to absorb the Doberman's wounds, it seems. My mother finishes putting on her white gloves and grabs my hand, inspecting my nails for unseat dirt and grime, clicks her tongue as if she's disappointed that no transgressions have been found embedded there. Let's go, Meg. I want to go see the Van Gogh exhibit before it closes. As we wander through the cathedral rooms of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, passing our eyes over sunflowers and haystacks and self-portraits of a long dead one-eared painter, I wonder why my mother will take us back to our white suburban home, to the man, her husband, my father, who regularly beats her bloody and blue and refused to file a complaint against him each and every time the police and ambulance show up at our door. But yet, she finds her power to wrestle a crowbar from a stranger beating a dog. And I wonder, is it because the stranger is a woman and Black?
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Marguerite. I know that that's a difficult story for you to tell and a difficult memory, but we really appreciate you sharing that with us today. Thank you so much. Our next Our next storyteller is Denise McIntosh, who I have told stories with in a couple of different settings. And her story today is Return Trip. And so, Denise, why did you decide to write this story? You're muted, Denise.
I even had a note about that. The events of this story really brought home to me the importance of standing up.
Nice. And so this is Return Trip.
My boss called me into her office on a Wednesday afternoon. I just got permission to take you to Mexico with me. My mouth dropped open. You have a passport. We're leaving Friday morning. I'll arrange your tickets. I did not have a current passport. Turns out a formal letter on proper stationery submitted to the authorities could fix that in one day. At least it could in the 1980s. I rushed off to get passport photos, do laundry, cancel my weekend plans, and pack a suitcase. The event in Mexico, to which I was suddenly invited, was a conference of young international scholars, all of whom had been funded by the foundation for which I worked. The foundation wanted to foster the cross-pollination of policy ideas and comparative analyses, to leverage new and vital connections between disparate fields of endeavor, to promote international peace and cooperation among non-traditional partners, blah, blah, blah. All the usual highfalutin language that got trotted out with each funding cycle. Scholars would be gathering from across the country and around the world. The conference had been in the works for months, but I get included 2 days out? Whatever. I didn't have time to catch my breath long enough to ask the questions. The conference was held in a 15th century fort, now resort, 2 hours south of Mexico City. Medieval walls encircled several stone buildings, and part of the moat system had been turned into swimming pools. I wasn't complaining. 4 days of fun in the sun was a welcome respite from a Chicago winter and sitting at a desk. Plus, since I'd been added so late, I didn't really have any official duties except to get to know the scholars. Well, alrighty then. We swam, golfed, went horseback riding, lay about in hammocks, and got drinks delivered to us pretty much anywhere on the grounds. That is, when we weren't in mandated workshops, discussion groups, and formal dinners. Even the fort's 500-year-old chapel had been repurposed and was now a Gothic dance bar, stained glass, and a disco ball. And putting all those young scholars on the dance floor every night was probably the best thing the foundation ever did for international relations, if you know what I mean. My return flight was routed through Dallas. We deplaned, collected our luggage, and then waited in line at the international entry gate. Several of the scholars had been on the flight out of Mexico City with me, so I waited in line with one of my swimming pool buddies, an academic from Belize named Kerry, who was returning to his research center on the East Coast. When it was my turn, I handed over my paperwork and got waved through with barely a glance. I pulled my suitcase past the gate, and there I was, back in the US of A. I don't know what impulse made me look back, because I had a flight to catch to Chicago. But for whatever reason, I looked back. Kerry had not been waved on with just a glance. Kerry had been stopped. Kerry was dressed in a crisp navy sport coat, button-down shirt, and jeans, signaling loud and clear his academic status. He was as big as the guard, maybe bigger, which meant there were 2 giants facing off at the gate. The guard was in a khaki military-style uniform, and he was, surprise, white. The white guy had all of the official control in this scenario, and he knew it. He was holding Kerry's papers and starting to ask questions. Kerry, very large and very dark, was now very patient, like he'd been through this before. Carrie's passport was from Belize, not the US, but that was an international checkpoint. The guards should have been used to a variety of travelers. Mostly, he was a very large Black man, and I think that automatically challenged this Dallas security guard. Possibilities for the next several minutes, hours, days of Carrie's life rolled through me intuitively in maliciously mundane scenes. The armed escort to a private room, the belligerent, intrusive questions about his activities, the escalating emotional violence and intentional degradation. It didn't take much for my mind to imagine all of this in a few seconds when I turned around. I started to walk back, dragging my luggage behind me. The guard saw me out of the corner of his eye and turned only his head towards me. "Ma'am, you are cleared through. You can't come back. Now just move along." He actually made a little shooing motion with his hand. I stopped, planted my feet, even though my knees were shaking, looked at Carrie, unflappable and patient in a way I would never in my life learn to be. I looked at the guard. "I'm waiting for my friend," I said. The guard narrowed his eyes at me and pressed his lips into a straight line. He turned his head back to Carrie, stared at him for too long, and then silently handed back all of his papers and waved him through. Carrie caught up to me and we looked at each other. After seeing him clear the checkpoint, I was shaking with tension and relief, but also roiling with shame that had happened to him, that he'd been othered and stopped for no good reason, that I'd been witness to the scene of this attempted degradation, and that it had been my program, my foundation, that had somehow inadvertently put him on this trajectory towards a racist confrontation in the Dallas airport. But we both had other planes to catch, and even less time now to do so. We didn't have time to debrief, and besides, maybe he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe better to flick it off, like a fly on his lapel. We said our goodbyes and turned in different directions towards our next gates. Today, I believe the whole reason I was invited to that conference that I was never really supposed to attend was so that I could be there in that airport, in that moment, as a witness and as an ally. The scenario in Dallas wasn't about the guard. I doubt he remembered us even 5 minutes later. And it certainly wasn't for Carrie's benefit. I'm sure he would have handled the situation just fine on his own, despite the provocation. No, that incident was for me. It was to help me find my voice, to help me put my Scottish stubbornness to good use, and to reinforce the responsibility that I already knew I had, but in a very deep, visceral way, not just as a Sunday school lesson. And my responsibility and delight is this: to stand up in the face of bullying, bigotry, and casual inhumanity and say, "You are my friend." I never saw or spoke to Carrie again. 1980s, no email. But frankly, I hope Carrie did flick it off and doesn't remember Dallas at all.
Wow. Thank you, Denise, for that powerful lesson. It is amazing how often things need to be flicked off. And it is so wonderful when people stand up to bullying and to bigotry and to hatred. And so thank you. Thank you for being that friend. Raquel Candace Jones and I have told stories together as recently as November for the Filet of Solo Festival here in Chicago. Raquel is going to tell us a story today. Truth and Peace is the Path. Raquel, why did you write this story and want to share it?
Thank you, Willa. I wrote this story to shine a light on the aggressions and the microaggressions that fracture our relationships and our society, always.
Nice. And so truth and peace is the path.
The year was 2011, and I was a summer cohort of Chicago Career Tech. CCT, as we called it, was a 6-month, 5-day-a-week retooling program equipping middle-income earners with the skills necessary for high-demand technology-based careers. As participants, we received a weekly stipend while still qualifying for unemployment insurance, excuse me. We interned 3 months with a corporation or government agency, and then 3 months with a nonprofit organization while receiving classroom training and professional development. Now, while this program sounds great in theory, the reality was oftentimes a different story. Because much like the American experiment, which too was ambitious in its inception, the hearts of men still had to be dealt with. My chosen concentration in CCT was social media marketing. This was at a time when social media was new and businesses were just learning how to navigate it. My job as an intern was to learn the company's existing social media practices and/or assist the company in developing some. Unfortunately for me, much of that did not happen. You see, businesses were giving huge tax breaks for hosting CCT participants, many of whom used this opportunity not to equip, but to access free labor. Free labor, what America was built on. Instead of the program being an instrument facilitating individual and societal progress, many cohorts like myself were exploited and given menial tasks that the business would normally pay a temp agency for. Was this intentional? I can't say. I'll let you decide for yourself. It was my first day, and I ran into a small white woman, I'll call her Doris, in the restroom. She was quite friendly, and we exchanged pleasantries. I discovered Doris was executive assistant to the president of the company. Our desks sat adjacent to each other. My immediate supervisor was a young white woman, perhaps 25 years my junior. She proceeded to give me tasks that were not social media related. Both were both time and labor intensive, but relatively mindless. After a few weeks of this busy work, I asked when we would get on to social media. She said that the company didn't have a social media presence and that the work I was doing took precedent. She was clearly agitated that I had even asked. A few weeks later, I was instructed to develop a social media plan for the company, which I did. I presented the plan at an all-department meeting and was well received by the other employees. The vice president offered to write me a recommendation at the conclusion of my time there. Shortly after that, my supervisor called me in to tell me that Doris had requested that I stop wearing perfume because it was making her ill. By that time, I had already been at the company, sitting adjacent to Doris for a good 9 weeks, and I wasn't wearing any perfume. I told my supervisor this and inquired why Doris did not take medication for her condition. Needless to say, I didn't change anything. A few days later, my supervisor came to me again. Why won't you stop wearing whatever you're wearing? She's just an old woman and you're making her sick. I was appalled. This was a small company and they didn't have an HR department. If they had, I surely would have gone to it. I told my supervisor again, I've been here over 9 weeks and now Doris has a problem? I'm not wearing anything but soap. Should I stop using soap? And furthermore, why do I have to make adjustments for her ailment, especially when she can do something about it? Shortly after that, another woman who worked at the company, who herself was a CT graduate, pulled me to the side and informed me that Doris had done the same thing to the previous CCT participants, all of whom were Black women. There it was. There was the problem. Who knows whether Doris really had hyperosmia, a condition caused by a person having a lower threshold for scents, most often perfume. My predecessors and I had been at the company several weeks before the way we smell became an issue for her. And instead of the company requiring Doris to do something about what's clearly her problem, they enabled her. At my exit interview, my supervisor asked me what I thought of my time at the company. I told her honestly, it was a waste of time. I was tasked with the work that the company should have hired a temp for, and I learned nothing more about the business side of social media. To top it all off, I had to deal with microaggressions, which at any other company would have been addressed by HR. Oh, she got red in the face, visibly angry at the truth I had just spoken. Well, you could be more appreciative of the experience we gave you, she responded. Needless to say, the vice president didn't give me a recommendation he promised either. I'm sharing this story because racial healing will only occur when all parties are willing to share and accept the truth about themselves and the systems that have been put in place to promote and create disparities. Once heard, we must then have the willingness to do something on a personal and structural level. It will be uncomfortable. The loss of privilege always is. And it will take forgiveness, because nothing happens without forgiveness. But trying to hide the truth or change the narrative will not work, not for any genuine healing. Truth coupled with peace is the path to walk in order to reconcile and heal the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Candace, for that reminder, right? It's not just peace, but truth and peace. I think about the Truth and Reconciliation program in South Africa to help them overcome years of apartheid. I think about the kind of reconciliation work and truth that they have done in Germany to try and combat anti-Semitism and to remind themselves and others of what can happen when we let ourselves fall into that path. So thank you for that story. And I think Doris is going to be a name I'm going to be using in the future. This next storyteller, who is coming to us, would probably say that she's a newer teller. And that might be true, but God knows her stories are phenomenal and her writing is really, really incredible. And so this is Ruth Behrman, who's going to tell us a story called Reclaiming Life. And Ruth, why did you decide to share this story today?
Well, I decided to share it because I see it as a cautionary tale. What can happen when the sense of the other is taken to extremes?
Well, here it is, Reclaiming Life.
After my mother passed in 2016, I cleared out the house for sale. In their nearly 50 years in that home together, until Dad died in 2013, my parents held on to every scrap of paper, including bill receipts, old passports, correspondence, IDs. Among the paperwork I kept was an identity card with a headshot of my father from 1948. It's from the local government of Rheinland-Pfalz in Western Germany in German, French, and English. It states, the holder of this card belongs to the category of people who in the past years were severely persecuted by the Nazis for race reasons. There are two other categories, political and religion, which are crossed out. Hitler never minced words about the subhumans, the Jews, responsible for all ills in society. My mother endured concentration camps, and my father was slave labor because he had trade skills earned after he was kicked out of high school under the Nuremberg laws. They survived partly due to luck. In the worst years, they were in their late teens and early 20s, the best age for good health, athletic prowess, fast reflexes. She was incredibly intuitive, a creative with dancing and acting skills, a leader of her friend group. He was extremely bright, a bicyclist on steep hills, a soccer player, a champion table tennis player. He could still beat people, by the way, till he was in his 60s sometime. After the end of World War II, when they had nothing much but their nearly toothless lives, my father, Heinz, wrote a letter to the person in charge where my mother, Margaret, lived in another German town. They knew each other from dancing school in Cologne before they were deported to Latvia and knew each other's parents. They connected again. Months later, on the shortest day and the longest night, as he put it, December 22nd, 1945, they married. No family. There's one faint photo, a double exposure of two young people in suits smiling to commemorate the day. My father reclaimed his family home in the small town of Zimmern, Rheinland-Pfalz, and I was born there in mid-1949. Dad developed a solid transport business, but Ma said she didn't want to raise a Jewish child in Germany after everything they had been through. It took us a couple of years to get everything in order to come to America. In August 1951, we came to Chicago. In the 1950s, my parents tried to become American as quickly as possible. It wasn't great to be foreign, and any problems people may have had were kept quiet. Though he was smart enough to go to school again, he couldn't sit still long enough to study. Besides, he had a family and limited money. He became an auto mechanic. The folks said they didn't talk about their war experiences at home, but there was a shadowy presence always, though the shadows got fainter over many years. The shadow was still strong when I was very small. I remember many conversations at dinner, Ma talking about my father's childhood plans to become a veterinarian and the bougie life my parents had as children. My younger brother and I were both encouraged to go to college and beyond, to the best schools we could attend, to follow professional paths. They both got to be 90 years old. How did that happen? I read about surviving well into the golden years with a suggested list of 10 important activities. It seemed they were doing 9 of them, including attending religious services, being positively involved with neighbors, reading books and newspapers, exercising, keeping friendships alive, paying attention to health. What I also felt was very important in keeping them alive was the opportunity to tell their stories in their 70s and 80s. How did a couple of immigrants with grammar school educations get this done? They started out telling about themselves in Friday night services at their synagogue. The wonderful Rabbi Mark Shapiro at BJBE encouraged people to say what was in their hearts as well as on their minds. Hearing my mother's talk, I was reminded of Toastmasters, but it was better, no scoring. They were asked to speak at my brother's kids' school in Knoxville, Tennessee. Before they agreed to do it, they asked for prepared questions. I heard later that people were surprised at the skill of their answers, as well as the delivery. When they were interviewed by Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, Dad's trials and his understanding had him also speak about the suffering in Rwanda, that some people still dehumanize the other. My parents were speakers at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, both to live audiences and to schools, broadcast from the museum. Their favorite audiences were young people, the future. They showed me a stack of letters from young listeners thanking them for their talks, which I hung on to. These letters were surely bound to my parents' spirit. Perhaps they changed some minds as well. In 2008, Dad and Ma were guests of Zimmern, the town of his youth. Dad started his speech by saying, translated to English, "My parents, my sister, and I lived, worked, and went to school like everyone else in Zimmern before 1933. He talked about Kristallnacht, his wife and their deep bond, and the deportation of his family in 1941. The speech ended, "Vergesse nie, dass der Preis für Freiheit ist ewige Wachsamkeit." Never forget, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. My hope for 2025 is that we remain vigilant and brave like my parents, that we tell our stories and understand that our continued freedom and quite possibly our survival depend on weathering the days ahead as best we can. And I would add that we be careful where and when we tell our stories. Thank you.
Wow. Ruth, what a fascinating testament both to your parents and to the power of story. And that phrase, never forget, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. That's incredible. And it has such resonance for today and for where we are in the world. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's such a gift when you get to know someone's story. A gift both for the teller of that story and for those of us who get to listen. So thank you, Ruth, for sharing that story about your parents. BJ Parker and I ran into each other a couple of weeks ago at an event. And it had reminded me, as soon as I saw her, of what an incredibly powerful storyteller she is. And so I invited her to join our story circle today. BJ is going to tell a story called Where We're Headed. And what made you decide to tell this story today, BJ?
Thanks, Willa. I decided I chose to just account a story because of my desire to continue to heal my own racial trauma. And I can certainly do it through recounting stories. So here we go. Where are we headed? I was born in Carpenter, Mississippi, located in Claiborne County, in my maternal grandparents' home. The midwife, Miss Lizzie, delivered me as she did most of the children in the rural area. Some would say my early years were idyllic, except for the racism and segregation. I remember the feeling and silence in my home the night that Emmett Till was found murdered for whistling at a white girl. The visit of my kindergarten class to the Jackson, Mississippi Zoo. As we were walking around and looking, I sat on a bench. I was tired. All of a sudden, I heard this clicking. I was swooped up by the kindergarten teacher. I tussled with her to put me down. And when she did, she walked me over to the bench to show me the sign that stated for whites only. It was quite difficult for my young brain to understand. Didn't we Negroes need a place to sit down if we wanted to? My grandmother having to address the teen in the general store by Miss Susie. When the family and other locals would travel to Jackson, Mississippi for an outing on a summer day and stand in line at the Negro window for the famous foot-long hot dogs at the Redwood Inn. The signs on the water fountain, white and colored. Dr. Martin Luther King stated in his 1967 speech entitled, "Where do we go from here?" I began to reflect on his question. Recently, I visited the Legacy Museum and Peace Garden in Montgomery, Alabama. The museum depicted in grand, sobering detail the atrocities bestowed on Black Americans, scene after scene, decade after decade. The shuttle bus transported visitors from the museum to the Peace Garden. The scenes were absolutely jaw-dropping, horrific. In one area of the Peace Garden, large slabs of concrete were suspended from the rafters of the structure, with the names engraved of bodies that were viciously lynched or other horrifyingly wicked methods of murder of Black men, primarily county by county, state by state. Most of the cruel killings occurred in Southern American states. I stopped at the slab inscribed with Claiborne County, Mississippi, the county where I was born. The killings took place in 1884 through 1899. There were plaques throughout the Peace Garden depicting many stories. A few stories that stood out to me were in 1908, William Donegan was lynched in Springfield, Illinois, for having a white wife. David Walker, his wife, and 4 children were lynched in 1908 in Hickman, Kentucky, after Mr. Walker was accused of using inappropriate language with a white woman. In 1916, Frank Dodd was lynched for annoying a white woman. As the other visitors and myself got back on the shuttle bus, a gentleman from Germany was on the bus. He stated he had visited Holocaust museums and they were as impactful. Impactful in what way? I asked, what do you think of the Legacy Museum and Peace Garden? He just refused to acknowledge the outstanding work of Brian Stevenson and his team. Can you just let us have this moment, please, that all the work, passion, creativity, research, inscribing names was a remarkable display of African American history? Where do we go from here? I went on to Selma, Alabama, the place where a dark side of American history was born, visited Brown Chapel AME, where meetings were convened to march to the state capitol after Jimmy Lee Jackson, a voters' rights activist, was brutally murdered, protecting his family from a vicious white mob. This led to the March 7, 1965 Bloody Sunday, as marchers crossed the Pettus Bridge and were met by white attackers. Did I hear the voices and cries of Blacks as I crossed the Pettus Bridge? Where do we go from here? My answer to Dr. King's question is another question. Where are we headed? Even now, Karen, the entitled white woman, is used whenever a white woman is annoyed by a person of color. In 2020, it is 2025, and there are fires raging in California, and a very disgruntled white man is stating it is because of DEI and hiring of Black firefighters. Excuse me? Where are we headed? In Dr. King's talk, he emphasized the role of nonviolence and hitting corporate America in their pockets, not shopping at their places of businesses, and demanding inclusion for Black Americans. If the Supreme Court of the land has struck down race-based college admissions leading to DEI programs in other contexts, where are we really headed? The country has elected a convicted felon as 47th President of the United States. Where are we headed? This is a wonderful initiative to have a day of racial reckoning, and I am all for it. But I keep thinking of the 10th anniversary of the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where Dr. King gave his speech 58 years ago. Where are we going from there? DEI basically scrapped by the Supreme Court, the strides made in higher institutions of learning and some corporate boardrooms. There are few strides for Black American, few steps forward, but white on Black crime, cops killing Black at alarming rates. Rodney King stated years ago, can we all get along? Food deserts in many Black communities across the United States, an uptick in pharmacy deserts in Black communities. The elimination of Black history from curriculums in so many states now. Where are we headed? It is my hope that despite the looming odds of Blacks being silenced and erased, we will not annoy any white folk, and we continue to share our stories, continue to extend the olive branch, continue to respond with compassion, kindness, and grace to those persons who continue to walk the path of non-acceptance and violence. We must never be afraid of annoying anyone with our truths. That is where we can go from here and where we all can be headed. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ, for that reminder and that call to action. I think about what it means that most of us, certainly on this story circle, have lived through times of segregation, of horrific racial violence, to see where we are now. And the idea that we are moving backwards as opposed to moving forward to a more peaceful, more justice-fueled society is frightening to all of us. And even though there is this commemoration of a National Day of Racial Healing, which comes on the heels of the birthday commemoration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it is not enough. And I think your piece is a definite call to action for us to keep that, as all the pieces are. As Ruth and Ruth's father reminded us, that never forget that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And that's what we have to do. Thank you for that, BJ. Shireen Snow is up next, coming from someplace that's actually even colder, I think, than Chicago is today, from Minnesota. Shireen is an incredible actor as well as a storyteller. And Shireen is going to share with us today her story, Healing. It starts with me. Healing, it starts with me. Why, Shireen, did you write this story?
I wrote this story because I couldn't see hope. I couldn't see hope for the next 4 years. I'm not sure yet if I see it, but that's why I wrote it.
And so here it is.
Healing. It starts with me. I'm so sorry. I thought I could do this. I thought I could find a way to healing in spite of right now. I had such high expectations for this country, so much hope for the future, and now I'm dangling in midair. My heart has sunk so low. It is enveloped in a dark mass of murky slush, trying to swim without arms. My feet are bound and I can't move my knees. What do I do? I'm screaming, but can anyone hear me? As babies, we would cry as a sign that we needed food, changing, to be rocked to sleep, or just to be held, to be loved. We needed to be comforted. I could really use some comforting right now. It would give me such solace to feel the warmth of the sun wrapped around my being, whispering in my ear, "It's all right. I am here. I am shining just for you. I am illuminating your heart and soul with the sweeping rush of my vibrant rays. I won't leave you, and I will keep you safe." But we all know that the sun can't shine on us all of the time, that there are days of many clouds and an ocean of rain. Without them, the thermostat would be set to tepid and the light would hover on dim. How do we go back to our childhood and see the world as children again? Playing in the street, screaming, "Red light, green light!" Being cooled in the summer heat by the rushing stream of the fire hydrant. Giggling with the giddiness of smiles so broad that the sun is rivaled by the glow. Squealing like the sound of an ungreased door, just because. It was more trouble-free then, as we put our bodies through rigorous hours of jumping double dutch and swinging on the monkey bars, running forward as we looked back, bobbing and weaving, the outstretched arm and the hand reaching for us as it touches us and yells, "Tag!" Our yoke was easy then, and there was no fight. Today, we live so much of our lives fighting for that last piece of cake, fighting to stay awake when we really need to sleep, fighting to get our point across, fighting to make right the wrongs that plague us. But is that even possible? Is there a place, space, where my heart can open so wide I can let forgiveness in? If not forgiveness, perhaps compassion. If it is, how do I connect to it? How do I see that no matter the circumstance, there is still beauty on this earthly plane? We come into this world wearing our parents' trauma. It's a given. But how do we separate ourselves from it? They raise us. And in the raising, we begin to experience our own life traumas. The list continues to grow as our bodies are compounded by the weight of life. But then the trauma of race enters the room, and there sits the elephant waiting to be recognized. Just as babies, we strive for the same thing. How do we escape the color of our own skin? How do we exist in a vacuum of non-judgment? The answer I find is we can't. It will always be there. The judgment, the fight, the anger, the pain. So then the most profound question is, where do I begin to speak about healing? A healing of the mind, of the heart, of the spirit. What do I do to heal myself? Can I heal myself? If I can, what will it take? I am no longer willing to swing hands or arms or yell so loud that my vocal cords disappear. I don't have it in me to stomp my foot until they go numb. My body is no longer the version of my former, younger self, as I've proven by the arthritis in my knees as they calmly yell, "Don't even think about it." So, what can I do when forgiveness is not on the table and compassion has not yet entered the room? A conversation, perhaps? When my parents transitioned, I joined a bereavement group of like-minded and likened experienced people in an effort to not feel so much pain, to speak my hurt in a room with those who understand, to hear the hearts and hold space for their comfort. Maybe, just maybe, that is the way to go, but with a twist. A dear friend said to me, create a book club without the book. We can sit and commiserate with an opportunity to offer sunshine to one another and deepen my muscle of compassion so that it is no longer a fight, but a meeting of the hearts of those who seek to bring change into this country, this world, peaceably. Perhaps, just perhaps, my hope for 2025 is that perhaps becomes a yes. Thank you.
Wow. Perhaps becomes a yes. What a great hope for 2025 and beyond. Shireen, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us of what it means and what it takes to fight and to bring peace and to say maybe, perhaps, and turn that into a yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
William Gregory is our next storyteller, and part of what I have always loved about William's work is his use of languages, and the beautiful rhythm, symphony, and poetry of his work. William is going to share a tale called Niña del Sol. And William, why did you want to share this piece today?
Well, the other day I was watching the news, like so many of us are at times now, and I was watching the wildfires of Chicago, and they were talking about all of the Mexicans, the undocumented Mexicans that had volunteered, and I remembered how many Mexicans served in the Civil War. An eighth of the soldiers were Mexicans. And it got me to thinking about a short story I wrote a couple of years ago, and it made me think about the real point of the story. And I rewrote the story, and I wrote Niña del Sol, which is daughter of the sun, the translation.
And here is Daughters of the Sun, Niña del Sol.
My tío Arnoldo had a baby blue Fiat the size of a bug. And every year, when my mother, little sister Peachy, and I spent eternal summers in Guatemala, we'd get into my uncle's carrito with our spoiled twin cousins, Maritza and Marisol, and my tia Aura, squeezing into the bug, traveling through the highlands and coastal regions. Ay, Junior, move over. Stop farting. Your chucherias are staining my clothes. It was all that chile you ate. Stop! Marita's pulling my hair. Nuh-uh, you liar. I'm gonna tell my tia I didn't say that. If you don't stop estas chingaderas right now, I'm gonna pull over. I gotta pee. Basta. To say that we were squished and squashed, layered and stuffed like an order of taquitos with guacamole on top would be an understatement. But we were happy. Our small village crawling out of the miniature car, stretching our legs at the footsteps of a smoking volcano, or eating hot, freshly ground tortillas from a marchanta's metate, sprinkled with chicharrones and lime, or spending the night in swinging hammocks while iguanas crawled underneath us on the sandy beaches of Verapaz. We were not in San Diego anymore. There was no questioning why my sister and I would cry each time we had to leave Guatemala. If there is something I will forever be thankful to my mother for, it's in how she made us comfortable with being uncomfortable. No consentido, not spoiled though. On one of our many adventures, we pulled over into a town called Esquipulas. The town's cathedral is known for its Black Christ, and twice a week, the TRHT come down from their mountain villages to sell their wares. Looking down onto the square, the entire plaza seems to be draped like a giant multicolored Cristo art piece. Rows and rows of stalls displaying weavings, tejidos, blankets, fabrics, and huipiles explode with visceral color like fireworks, making you want to touch everything just to make sure it's real. Those are fruits and vegetable dyes. I can still hear my mother reminding me, it's no wonder I wanted to lick the bright green, yellow, and magenta colored weavings. My sister and I watched our tia and the twins up ahead of us in the market, nodding, screaming, "No, marchanta," and walking away rudely from each and every vendor. She's so tacaña. What's that? I asked. Cheap, my mother said to me in English. She talks to them like they're her servants. My mother and her sister would occasionally get into disagreements with one another. I never knew why, but I was starting to see a pattern. Don't you ever treat them like that. You hear me? I said yes, but I didn't know what I was saying yes to. Junior, come here. My uncle called out to me, telling me to come and see a TRHT girl dressed in her tribal clothes. She was sucking on a tiki pineapple soda out of a sandwich bag. A crowd of gawkers stared at her like a sideshow freak. Her skin glowed like a pitaya, and I had never seen anything like it before. The little girl, the color of a dragon fruit, nervously laughed. Her eyes closed, head tilted towards the sun, as if she wanted to be anywhere else. Es tu hermana, Junior, my uncle said, laughing, as his squat body waddled away, jumbled keys rattling on his hip. My mother yanked me away, saying, Pobrecita. Is that really my sister, Mommy? Of course not. That's an albino Indian girl. They're called Niños del Sol, children of the sun. Tío said that Daddy came here and had another family. I want you to hear me. She was born that way, and there's nothing wrong with her. Sometimes we have to love people, regardless of the stupid things they say and do. You are Maya. Your family name is Kohulun, and no one can take that away from you. Like every good thing, we come in as many colors as you see in this market. Todos bellos. Love them all, mijo. I'll always remember the adventures we had in my tío's sardine can of a car, driving through Guatemala. Truthfully, my uncle Arnoldo frightened me. He was a macho-strutting, misogynistic Chihuahua. But that moment I shared with a beautiful indigenous girl in the market shines bright in me. I saw a reflection of my white skin staring back at me. Maybe that's why I was so afraid to learn that I was her and she was a part of me. And yes, my mother assured me I was a part of her. My hope is for 2025 is that we can treat each other better. It's going to help us get through this. Thank you.
William, you know, I could listen to you tell stories all day. I just love the way that you weave your culture into every story that you tell, and how beautiful it is to hear the language, hear the story in its native language, and know that I understand it without you even having to translate. That's the humanity that comes through in storytelling, right? That we get connected to one another, regardless of what the language is. We understand the emotion of the story, the feelings of the story, and we connect. And that's why stories are such a gift. Thank you for that. I love that story so much. The little girl, the color of dragon fruit. Wow, brilliant. Thank you. Our final storyteller this afternoon is someone I've also told stories with and laughed a lot with. She's a really wonderful storyteller, and I'm so happy that she was able to join us today. And so for our final story today, we have Nancy Solomon, who's telling What Can I Do? And Nancy, why are you telling us this story?
I'm telling this story because I'm trying to survive this administration.
And so here we go. What can I do?
Three boys from my 5th grade class chased me into a doorway and I cower in a corner as they pelt me with pebbles. They scrape off the sidewalk and they shout, "Dirty Jew, dirty Jew, dirty Jew." And then they just walk away. I guess they didn't know what to do next. It's the first time I remember being bullied because I'm Jewish. But what's really weird is that I know almost nothing at all about being Jewish. See, my parents agree with Karl Marx that religion is the opiate of the people, and it's a way to keep the lower classes compliant and docile and the upper classes rich and powerful. But those three boys make me want to know why people don't like Jews and why they think they have the right to throw pebbles at me, and if there's anything I can do about it. I just don't tell my parents. In fact, I never tell my parents anytime I get attacked verbally or physically because I'm a Jew. Like when a girl decides to sit in my assigned seat in social studies and I say, "Excuse me, but you're sitting in my seat." And she says, "I know. I'm not moving for a Jew." My entire Jewish education consists of my dad pointing out an article in the newspaper and saying, "Great story here about Jonas Salk," or Jack Benny, or Lauren Bacall, or some other celebrity. Jewish, you know. My kid brother Danny and I never celebrate any Jewish holidays because we don't even know they exist. Yet every single year, our father writes notes for us to give to our teachers, excusing us from school on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, whatever they are. And it's not like we do anything special on those days. My father goes to work, my mother goes back to bed, and Danny and I just hang out at home. However, my family celebrates Christmas. We decorate a tree, we sing Christmas carols, we open presents, the whole Ganze Megillah. But not because it's Jesus's birthday. No, it's because my parents consider Christmas an American holiday, just like Thanksgiving. My family never talks about the Holocaust either. But someone gives me a copy of Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, and I read it. And one day I find an old magazine that's just filled with photographs of what the Allied forces found when they liberated the Nazi concentration camps as the World War II ended. I see photographs of what look like living skeletons with skin stretched over their bones, dressed, partially dressed, not dressed at all, in what looked like filthy, faded, ragged, striped pajamas. I see photographs of crematoria and piles of bodies the Nazis hadn't had time to get rid of. The photograph I remember the most is this huge pile of shoes with little tiny baby shoes at the bottom. 6 million Jews died in those camps, including Anne Frank. But so did 3 million other people. Catholics, political dissidents, Poles, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, mentally and physically disabled people, Roma, and anybody else who annoyed Hitler. But that doesn't even count all the people the Nazis killed in cities, villages, and towns. So I start to make a mental note of people that other people hate, and I include them. The list continues to grow when my family takes an overnight railroad trip from New York City to Hot Springs, Virginia for my uncle's wedding. My parents book a super deluxe drawing room. We have our own bathroom and a butler. But during the night, the train crosses the Mason-Dixon line. And when my brother Danny and I wake up in the morning, we discover the train now has whites only and colored only passenger cars. And we look out the window and we see whites only and colored only signs over water fountains and rating rooms for the towns that we pass through. And in naive defiance, Danny and I sit in the colored only railroad cars. When I'm 20 years old, I'm doing summer stock at the Rabbit Run Theater in Madison, Ohio, on the beautiful shores of Lake Erie. And the cast and crew often eat in this little cafe that's near the theater because it's cheap and also because they serve the most extraordinary strawberry pie in the entire universe. But one day I noticed that another customer keeps staring at my head. And so I pass my hands over my hair to dislodge what's ever there, but there's nothing. And he keeps staring. And so finally I say, excuse me, sir, but why are you staring at my head? You a Jewess? A Jewess. Yes. Where are your horns? Now, by this time, I'm 20 and a woman of the world. I know that Jews are often depicted with horns and tails and cloven feet, just like Satan. And I also know there's a gorgeous statue of Moses that's been sculpted by Michelangelo, and it's in a basilica in Rome. And Moses is clutching the tablets inscribed with the Ten Commandments. And because Moses was also an Israelite, which is an early Jew, if you look carefully at his curly hair, you will see his horns. So I say to my fellow diner, I had my horns surgically removed. He is so relieved. When my daughters and I moved to Denver, I decided it's finally time to get a formal education in Judaism. But the closest thing I can find is a conversion class for non-Jews who are engaged to Jews. We meet for 26 sessions, and I call the class Jew School. The engaged couples sit together. I sit by myself, and it's easy to guess which one is the one that's going to convert because they're often blonde and their hair is naturally straight. They learn that Jews don't believe in original sin, which is a concept I never understood in the first place, and that we don't have a concept of heaven and hell, which I always suspected. You see, Jews believe that we only get one lifetime. It begins when we take our first breath and it ends with our last. And any immortality that we might have lives on in our good deeds and the good deeds of our children. And I also learn that I am absolutely entitled to dislike and despise other Jews like Netanyahu and the right-wing religious fanatics that support him and Bernie Madoff and and that lizard Stephen Miller and all Jewish Republicans. Although maybe I made all that up myself. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It is now 77 years after the Pebble incident. I'm sorry, but I still don't know why some people hate or fear other people so much that they feel they have the right to dehumanize them, enslave them, hurt them, kill them, control them, insult them, incarcerate, incinerate them. But I do know that any insults I've ever experienced are lowercase inconveniences in comparison to the atrocities so many other people have endured and often died from. But I have figured out something that I can do about it. And thanks to my friend George. Now, George is a really nice person, but he always calls me his Jewish friend. I don't like it. I'm sure that he makes all kinds of assumptions about me that simply aren't true or fair. I'm sure George believes I love to handle, to bargain, to Jew someone down. But I can't. I never could. I might be a foundling. Anyway, I recently realized that I do exactly the same thing George does. I attach attributes to people according to their heritage, their complexion, their clothes, whatever. For example, my friend Mary, her family came here from Ireland generations ago, and I am sure that alcoholism runs rampant in her family. And Jock's family is originally from Scotland, so of course he's tight with the dollar. And Jimmy's great-grandparents were enslaved, so of course he loves black-eyed peas and jazz. But none of that is true. Well, Jimmy does like very sophisticated jazz. So I just stopped doing it. I stopped making assumptions about people. Trust me, this is not an easy habit to break, but it pays off. So now I find I'm just curious about people. I find I protect myself less and I smile more, and lots of people smile back at me. And sometimes we get into these really delicious conversations. But I am not an idiot. I I don't engage with obviously crazy people and people who smell really bad. You know that pathetic those pathetic tiki torch people who marched through Charlottesville and they chanted, "Jews shall not replace us, blacks shall not replace us." I'm sure that at any moment they're going to add, "Women shall not replace us." Well, they scare the crap out of me, as does our new administration. The CEO of a company that builds and manages private prisons is encouraging people to invest in his company because his business is about to expand beyond his wildest imagination. He's already been told he will need even more prisons to house undocumented immigrants while they're waiting to be deported. So, my question is, who will they house after that? Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for that funny and touching story, and for the reminder that first they came for, right? Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our storytellers, Ruth, Denise, Nancy, William, Raquel, Marguerite, BJ, and Shireen. Thank you all for sharing these incredible stories of reckonings, reconciliations, and reflections. We know that today is the National Day of Racial Healing. But what our country and our society needs is a national day from hatred. Like all of our storytellers have spoken to, we need to judge less, demonize others less, and get to be curious and know people for who they are. Because as we know people, as we share our stories with one another, we see that we have much more in common than what divides us. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thanks again to all of our storytellers. I hope that even though today is the day that's recognized as a day of racial healing, we will take this as a beginning step and work throughout this year, and certainly throughout these next 4, to make sure that the history of our country, the true history of our country, is told and known, and that all of us share our stories of being human so that we can connect to our humanity and to the humanity of each other. Thank you so much. Thank you to Vince Pagan, who was our tech underlord today. Thank you to the Morton Group and to Creative Curriculum Ventures for sponsoring this day. And thank you to all who are participating in the National Day of Reconciliation, of Racial Healing and Reconciliation. Thank you so much for joining us. Peace.
Okay, we are no longer live.